Hunter here. So Blake typically does these things, but he finished up his series last week, and so I'm going to be taking over this next series I called Prepared. And the idea behind Prepared is we're going to be looking at characters from the Bible and looking at how God prepared them for their future and how that kind of relates to us, how what happened to them could be happening in our lives or relate to us. Obviously, not in the exact one-to-one stance, but how it relates to us. And the first character I want to talk about today, a character that when I think of people who are prepared for their future by God, this is the first person that comes to my mind, and it's David, King David of the Old Testament. And he's the first person that comes to my mind. And let's get into why that is. So, I'm talking about a famous story I'm sure a lot of you know, but hang with me for a little bit. So, David, anointed to be king of Israel. Saul's in charge right now, but God wants to throw Saul out. They need someone new. So David's anointed. Saul doesn't know that David's anointed, but David's anointed to be king one day. So God's got to get this kid from being a shepherd to one day being king of Israel. And so how's he going to do that? Well, David's got a few tricks up his sleeve, a few talents that he has that he's been doing since he was a little kid that God can use to prepare him in his future. And let's start with the first one. First of all, David, he's a bomb harp player, apparently. He's one of the best around, and God curses Saul to have headaches. And one of Saul's assistants, or servants rather, says, why don't you get a harp player? Because a harp player is what I think of when I have a headache to cure my headaches. Why don't I just get a harp player? Of course, it's so obvious. But that's what Saul does, is he goes, and the servant suggests a really good harp player, a boy from a nearby town. And that boy is, you got it, David. So David all of a sudden goes from being a shepherd boy, which he still is. He's still a shepherd even in this time, but he's now also the royal harp player and plays for Saul. Now, he might not be ready to be king right away. I don't know many harp players who went from being a harp player to being a king, but he's on the road. He's in the throne room, at least, playing the harp for Saul. And so there we go. First foot in the door. David has this talent, this skill that he's been doing since he was little, that God is now using to provide for him in the future and getting him to move forward along his plan. And so that's the first example. The second example, a little more famous. David, he's still a sheep herder at this time. He still watches after the sheep. But his three older brothers, they're now soldiers sent off in a war against the Philistines. And the Philistines have this great champion named Goliath, who's cursing the name of the Israelites' God and just tearing him down constantly. And eventually, Saul offers a reward. Anyone who's willing to fight and kill Goliath, their family won't have to pay taxes for the next year. And that's big for them. And one day, David's dad tells him to take some bread and some drink to his brothers in the army on the battlefield. And he does that. He takes it to his brothers to provide for them and help them out. And then he hears Goliath. He hears Goliath cursing the name of his God. And David's insulted. David's a man after God's own heart. He doesn't want to hear his God torn down. And then he hears about the deal that Saul offered. And David, he wants to take that deal. So he goes to Saul and he says, I want to fight Goliath. And Saul tries to give him all this armor, all this swords. He's like, no. I don't need that stuff. That stuff's not for me. See, what we didn't know, what he didn't tell us until now, is David has part of his job, part of what he's been doing is fighting large beasts. He fights lions and bears to protect the herds. He hunts them down and clubs them to protect the herd. He uses his sling to take them down from a distance. This is what David does. These are the talents that David has, and all suddenly these talents are coming into play again. So all David takes is his shepherd's sling and 5 stones from a river and his shepherd's bag. He goes out on the battlefield, challenges Goliath, and Goliath accepts. He mocks him and makes fun of him, says he's going to feed him to the birds. And David, not that intimidated. He knows he has God on his side. He knows he's been prepared for this because he's been using a sling his whole life. It's what he's been doing, and now suddenly it's coming into play. And so he puts a stone in his sling and 1 rock straight to the forehead. Now, we don't know if that's what killed him, if that's what killed Goliath, or David running up and taking Goliath's sword and cutting his head off. Yeah, that's something that happened. But we don't, the sling definitely helped. This past talent that David had was now providing for him in the future. And so God clearly prepared David for this moment. So how does that relate to us, though? What does that have to do with us now? None of us are in the throne to become king. Well, I'm here to tell you that the talents you cultivate now and the talents we work on, God will use those talents to provide for us in the future. For an example, this here behind me, this tennis arena back here, this is my Goliath's arena. I played tennis all through high school, and I never thought that one day I'd be teaching it myself. God has taken this skill that I had, this past talent, as a way to provide for me when I really needed a job or really needed money. God's taken that past talent of tennis and provided for me. And I'm positive he's going to do that in your guys' life too. So here's what I suggest. Pray about what talents and what skills God might use in the future. Try to find out what skills can be used that God can exemplify to glorify himself and you, to take care of you and him in the future. And also, don't be afraid to try new things. You never know what talent is going to click and what talent God's going to use in the future. So, I'm sure David did not think he was going to be killing warriors and soldiers in the field when he was just protecting his herd, but you never know how God's going to use your talents now to prepare you for your future. So don't be afraid to cultivate those talents, and don't be afraid to try new things and find new talents. And that kind of wraps up this first week of Prepared. And come back next week, and we'll be moving into the New Testament, where we talk about a guy named Saul, a different Saul. See you guys.